is, however, the case, I think, that Christianity inherits, by the time we get to the Hellenistic period, by the time we get into the period in which Christianity is emerging, we are looking in the Eastern Mediterranean at marriage as monogamous. The Gospels, the letters of Paul, the New Testament household codes all present marriage between one man and one woman. The household codes, and I'm not going to put them all up, we're going to look briefly at Ephesians and then at 1 Peter, offer, however, a vision of marriage which is explicitly hierarchical, in that the wife is said to be rightly subordinate to her husband. Although it's also a relationship with mutual responsibilities, in that a husband is reminded of his duty to love his wife. Now, people who work in this area tell me that that reminder that the husband has a duty to love his wife is actually quite unusual in the household codes of the period. The household codes tend to be more hierarchical without that love, but the interesting Christian elements that seems to be coming in through the Christian household codes or the New Testament household codes is that aspect of loving mutuality. However, it is loving mutuality within the context of a relationship in which the woman is meant to be and intended to be seen as subordinate to her husband. And I think that understanding of marriage persists through much of Christian history, as we're going to see. And a lot of the contemporary discussion around headship, which has implications not just for family relationships, but for arguments, for instance, around the ordination of women or around the discussion of the admission of women to the episcopate, is based on precisely this kind of understanding, that the order of creation, the natural order of creation, as it is replicated also properly in marriage, is about a hierarchical relationship. The man is has headship over the woman in the same way that Christ has headship over the church. So these texts, which actually come from a Stoic background, not from a Christian background at all, have had a really strong influence in understandings both of marriage and of the role of women and the way that those intertwine. It is worth noting, I think, however, that we don't read them, we tend to read them rather selectively. So I've given you one for Ephesians 5 there. 1 Peter 3, 1-7, very similar message, that wives should accept the authority of their husbands. So another hierarchical household code follows immediately, which we often find cited in these discussions, follows immediately on from a text which we don't often find cited these days, but which we would have found cited frequently in the anti-slavery debates in the 19th century, or the 18th and 19th century, as an argument for the Christian support for slavery. 1 Peter, these household codes are put together in a context in which the whole household is being regulated, and the whole household does not just include men and women and children, but also includes slaves. So when we read these texts about hierarchical relationships between men and women, we need to place those in the context of a society which is thinking about the household in a much bigger context. And I think it's really interesting that we tend to find 1 Peter 3, 1-7 these days being read out of context from 1 Peter 2, 18-21. We're not finding the advocates of headship arguing also for the return to slavery. And we might want to think about just what's going on there in terms of how different parts of the Bible are being read, perhaps with more emphasis on particular areas than on others. As I've said, the household codes were not originally Christian texts. They're drawn from the teachings of Stoic philosophers, who in themselves then draw on the understanding of Aristotle's understanding of the relationship between men and women. You can say that in many ways these scriptural texts, these scriptural household codes, or the scripturalization, to coin a word, of these household codes, the canonization of these household codes, represents precisely the assimilation of cultural norms of the time into Christianity. This is Christianity drawing on the way in which society was structured at the time. This is not something that just comes in from nowhere. This is part of the discussions that were going on in the Roman Empire about how men and women should relate to each other. So we're seeing here Christianity in the biblical period drawing on the cultural norms in the society in which it finds itself. And there's been some really interesting work done on marriage in the Gospel of Mark, where one of my German colleagues looked at different understandings of marriage as exemplified by divorce law in the first century, and found that actually what's happening as being drawn into the Gospels, being drawn into here, is one particular understanding of marriage. And that there were actually other understandings. For instance, there were areas in the Roman Empire in the first century where both men and women can petition for divorce. There are other areas where women can only petition for divorce with the permission of their husbands. And there are other areas where women can't petition for divorce at all. That's different sorts of thinking about marriage. So actually, even in the first century, there is a particular cultural norm that's being drawn in, but it is a selective cultural norm. Reflecting on marriage in the New Testament at an Affirming Catholicism conference, which we ran in January to look at the history of marriage with a series of specialists in that period, in different periods, New Testament scholar Joran Auckland reflected on which aspects of Old Testament law were taken into the New Testament. She identified that it was rules about sex and gender, including purity laws, which tended to be retained, whilst other laws in the Old Testament, such as those relating to clothing, tended not to be. Joran also highlighted the way in which sibling relationships actually form much of the thinking about relationships within the New Testament. And much of the writing about sibling relationships then gets carried over into how modern theology started to think about marriage. 1 Corinthians 13, for instance, is not exactly about sibling relationships either, but it's not actually directed at thinking about marriage. She came to the conclusion that the New Testament is about being part of the kingdom of God, and everything we do has to be measured against that standard. And she concluded the New Testament texts don't fit easily with modern understandings of marriage and the nuclear family. She asked a question which I will leave you to ponder with just for a second. Can you name one New Testament family which is presented in the New Testament in such a way that the father of the family would not have any difficulty in getting a position in a conservative congregation? We tried quite hard to come up with one, but it's not very easy. What I'm trying to say here is that the New Testament, the early church clearly knew marriage. We can see that from the New Testament, but that marriage was not a Christian institution. Marriage is an institution which is taken into the structures of the Christian church because it is an institution that already exists in society. Greek, Roman and Jewish marriage practices all influence developing Christian approaches to and understandings of marriage. And we see this particularly in 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul is grappling with the Christianizing of a pagan institution, and also an institution he's really not very convinced about because he thinks it distracts attention from following Christ. 1 Corinthians 7. And Paul grappling with the Christianization of a pagan institution, and really one that he's not at all sure is a really good idea. If people are going to get married, he thinks, if they really feel they have to get married because they can't control their sexual urges in any other way, then they should do that. But he'd really much rather they didn't. It's also instructive to look at his instructions or his thoughts on those married to non-Christian partners. If the spouse consents, he says, and this is the second text on the slide, then they should stay together, for the unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife, And I think this is actually the next slide. Yes, here we go. The unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through her husband. If it weren't for that, then your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are actually holy. Note that these are marriages not conducted through Christian ceremonies. They're marriages which have been conducted under Greek or Roman law, which are made holy by the presence of a Christian partner. And I think that may be quite helpful to us in thinking about how, as a church, to respond to the whole debate around civil partnerships, around same-sex marriage. If we can actually perhaps take a step back from thinking about marriage as a Christian institution and think of it as an institution which is actually, in a sense, a civic institution, which has ramifications far beyond the Christian community, and which is then made holy by the participation of Christians, we hope.